Have you noticed how some U.S. Canada border crossings have gone almost empty? Places once full of trucks, tourists, and commuters are now silent and still. But this quiet hides a bigger story, one about how much some U.S. states rely on Canadian money to keep their economies alive. From busy cities to remote towns, Canadian dollars flow in and keep businesses running. What if that money suddenly stopped? The effects would be harsh. Stores closing, factories shutting down, and tourism disappearing. In this video, we'll reveal the 10 states most at risk if Canadian cash dries up. Ready to see which states hang by this fragile financial thread? Let's get started. Number 10, New York. Imagine strolling down Fifth Avenue at 2 p.m. on a Saturday and hearing nothing but footsteps echoing off the storefront glass. No buzz, no bustle, just empty shops and nervous glances from behind dimly lit display windows. This isn't some post-apocalyptic scene, it's the economic aftermath of a missing Canadian lifeline. In 2023 alone, New York exchanged roughly $55 billion in goods and services with Canada, making the Empire State one of the largest players in the North American economic theater. But the dependency doesn't stop there. An additional $1.2 billion flowed in from Canadian tourists, money that fueled hotels in Manhattan, theater seats on Broadway, meals in Harlem's soul food kitchens, and even boutique art galleries in Soho. Canadian cards swipe through New York's economy like oxygen through lungs. Quiet, unnoticed, but absolutely essential. When those cards stop swiping, cash registers fall silent and delivery trucks slow to a crawl. Factories waiting on corn syrup from Ontario find their production lines stalled. Art exhibitions miss their key buyers. The glittering lights of Manhattan begin to flicker, not metaphorically but literally, as energy and trade sectors reliant on Canadian imports feel the squeeze. And the pain doesn't just stay in the city. Upstate towns like Plattsburgh and Watertown, whose economies rely heavily on weekend shoppers and cross-border employment, would face catastrophic downturns. New York may feel invincible, but its skyline stands on a fragile financial foundation. All it takes is a freeze from the north to turn the world's capital into a flickering shell. Number 9, Michigan. Could the Motor City grind to a halt if Canadian wallets stop crossing the border? The answer is a terrifying yes. With $53 billion in trade and an additional $1.7 billion in tourism revenue from Canada, Michigan's economy is practically interwoven with the health of its northern neighbor. The Detroit-Windsor corridor, once called the busiest international border crossing in North America, is more than a trade route. It's an artery of life for the state's automotive, agricultural, and retail sectors. Picture Flint's auto plants falling silent as parts shipments from Canadian suppliers stop at the border. Imagine family diners in Traverse City closing their doors when weekend customers from Ontario vanish. Even frontline workers in rural counties who rely on the tips from Canadian visitors would feel the shockwave. These aren't abstract figures. They're the cash in the register, the jobs on the line, and the morale of entire communities. The very identity of Rust Belt towns, already fragile from decades of manufacturing decline, is being held together by loony-fueled purchases of gas, groceries, and weekend getaways. Pull the plug, and the social fabric unravels just as quickly as the economic one. And yet many don't realize just how much is at stake until the traffic on the Ambassador Bridge slows to nothing. Number 8, Washington. Feel that chill creeping in from the Pacific Northwest? That's not just the ocean breeze. It's the slow freeze of an economic connection threatening to snap. Washington State may be best known for its tech hubs and coffee shops, but its economy has a quiet dependency few talk about: Canada. In 2023, roughly $25 billion in goods flowed between Washington and Canada. Add to that nearly $900 million in Canadian tourism dollars spent on whale-watching tours in the San Juans, wine tasting in Walla Walla, and artisan crafts in Seattle's Pike Place Market, and you begin to see the outline of something massive. Think about small ports like Blaine, where gas stations and family diners exist almost exclusively to serve cross-border truckers and shoppers. What happens when those fuel stops go dark and the warmth of Canadian coffee runs disappears from the morning rush? Even Seattle's iconic market would see foot traffic plummet without the influx of weekend visitors. In Capitol Hill, boutique retailers depending on loony-spending tourists might fold within a single season. Number 7, Minnesota. Can you picture the arrowhead of the Midwest trembling under the weight of financial frost? In the North Star state, the connection to Canada runs deeper than mere trade. With $20 billion in goods exchanged in 2023, including iron ore, medical devices, and agricultural equipment, and about $750 million in tourism revenue from Canadian visitors, Minnesota's bond with Canada is like ice beneath snow, solid but fragile. Picture border towns like International Falls or Grand Marais, where the glow of headlights from Canadian cabins and snowmobile trailers fuels local diners, bait shops, and motels. When those headlights stop appearing, so do the cash tips, the bar tabs, and the bustling winter economy. That means fewer shifts for servers, fewer parts orders for local mechanics, and empty chairs at seasonal concert venues and hockey rinks. Canadian patients visiting the Mayo Clinic inject hundreds of millions into the healthcare economy. If those patients vanish overnight, what happens to hospital staffing, medical research, and high-end rental housing markets? From the steel belts of Duluth to the farmlands of Mankato, the question becomes painfully clear. Can a state built on cold resilience survive when its warmest economic flow suddenly ices over? Number 6, North Dakota. The rugged plains of North Dakota might seem remote, but they are a vital link in this fragile economic chain. Trade between North Dakota and Canada in 2023 hit about $18 billion, much of it in energy, agricultural products, and manufactured goods. Canadian visitors funnel millions more into the economy, spending nearly $600 million on hunting trips, hotel stays, and dining in cities like Fargo and Bismarck. But imagine if that flow of Canadian dollars stopped suddenly. Hunting lodges would lose customers overnight, gas stations would see fewer fill-ups, and local farmers would struggle to sell equipment and crops across the border. The ripple effect reaches the small-town hardware stores, the mechanics who keep agricultural machinery running, and the school districts relying on the local tax base supported by stable jobs. The oil fields, too, which rely heavily on Canadian technology and investment, would face immediate slowdowns. Without Canadian trade and tourists pumping cash into the system, the economic vitality of North Dakota's communities teeters on the brink of collapse, leaving a harsh and uncertain winter in its wake. Number 5, Vermont. Nestled among the rolling green mountains, Vermont's economy is woven tightly with Canadian trade and tourism, especially from Quebec's southern communities. In 2023, Vermont exported over $8 billion worth of goods to Canada, including machinery, dairy, and forest products, while Canadian visitors poured nearly $700 million into Vermont's ski resorts, maple syrup shops, and artisanal markets. Imagine Stowe and Burlington streets emptied of familiar French-speaking tourists. The cozy inns and ski lodges shuttered because the revenue stream dried up. Without those dollars, many of Vermont's small businesses, already fighting the uphill battle of rural depopulation, would face closure. The maple syrup industry, a cornerstone of Vermont's identity and economy, would lose key buyers. Seasonal workers and hospitality staff would find themselves out of work just as winter arrives. Healthcare facilities that see Canadian cross-border patients would be forced to cut back services. Vermont's charming towns rely on that constant influx of Canadian money to keep their economies alive, and lose it, and the state risks becoming a shadow of its picturesque self. Number 4, Alaska. The vast, untamed wilderness of Alaska is deeply connected to its Canadian neighbors through trade and tourism, despite their remote geography. In 2023, Alaska traded around $6 billion in goods with Canada, including seafood, mining equipment, and timber. Canadian tourists contributed nearly $500 million to the state's fragile tourism sector, spending on cruises, fishing lodges, and guided adventures into the last frontier. Now envision a sudden halt in that Canadian spending. Tour operators reliant on Canadian guests would shutter their doors, leaving guides and fishermen unemployed. Cruise ships would find their cabins empty, and the ripple effect would spread through Alaska's delicate economy. Supply chains dependent on Canadian imports would tighten, raising costs for residents and businesses alike. Small border towns like Hyder and Tok, whose economies are propped up by Canadian visitors crossing for groceries and services, would be devastated. Without that lifeline, Alaska's economic isolation would deepen, compounding challenges from an already harsh climate and limited infrastructure. Number 3, Maine. Maine is America's gateway to the Canadian Maritimes, and its economy depends heavily on those northern neighbors. In 2023, Maine's exports to Canada totaled more than $12 billion, including paper products, seafood, and machinery, while Canadian tourists spent close to $800 million in the state. Now picture the quaint coastal towns, Bar Harbor, Portland, and Acadia National Park, bereft of the steady stream of Canadian visitors who fill inns, restaurants, and shops year-round. Lobster fisheries would see diminished orders, and local artisans would lose their primary customer base. Seasonal workers, already vulnerable to economic swings, would face layoffs just as the cold sets in. Trade-dependent industries would see raw material supplies shrink, driving costs upward and forcing layoffs. The loss of Canadian dollars would reverberate throughout Maine's economy, threatening the livelihoods of families and the sustainability of its proud coastal communities. Number 2, New Hampshire. New Hampshire, small but economically intertwined with Canada, imports millions of dollars in goods and depends heavily on Canadian tourism. In 2023, trade between New Hampshire and Canada hovered around $9 billion, while Canadian tourists contributed approximately $600 million annually to the state's economy. Imagine the White Mountains and lakeside resorts emptied of familiar faces, paying with Canadian currency. Ski areas like Loon Mountain and Mount Sunapee would see dramatic drops in visitors, forcing layoffs and closures. Local retailers, restaurants, and hotels would feel the immediate pinch. The manufacturing sector, reliant on Canadian suppliers, would face halted production lines. Without Canadian trade and tourism dollars, the Granite State's economy would quickly lose momentum, threatening its fiscal stability and community well-being. Number 1, Ohio. Ohio stands as the most precarious link in this chain, with an economic dependency on Canada that many find surprising. In 2023, Ohio exported over $60 billion in goods to Canada, with an equally impressive influx of Canadian tourist spending near $2 billion, supporting everything from Cleveland's vibrant arts scene to the industrial heartland of Cincinnati. The suspension of Canadian trade and tourism would ripple through Ohio's auto manufacturing plants, supply chains, retail corridors, and cultural institutions. Factories reliant on Canadian parts would shutter, and iconic attractions would face steep revenue declines. The loss would stretch beyond the cities. Rural counties that benefit from Canadian weekend shoppers and hospitality jobs would fall into economic crisis. Ohio's diversified economy, so often touted as resilient, depends on Canadian dollars flowing freely. Freeze that flow, and the state's fiscal balance would tip into chaos. The warning signs are subtle but urgent. Ohio's future hangs in the balance, its prosperity tethered to a border that could suddenly close. These states all share something important, a hidden connection to Canadian trade and tourism that many people don't realize. If that connection were suddenly cut off, the effects would be serious. Businesses closing, jobs disappearing, and entire communities struggling just to get by. So next time you cross the border or hear Canadian money being spent nearby, remember how fragile this balance really is. It's a powerful reminder that our economies are more connected and more vulnerable than we might think. If you found this interesting, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And don't forget to comment your thoughts below. We'd love to hear what you think.